Welcome back to this series introducing Herman Dooyeweerd's Roots of Western Culture. In this episode, we're going to explore Chapter 6 and Dooyeweerd's explanation of the humanistic ground motive. Dooyeweerd saw his current time as one of great spiritual struggle. In the past, humanism had acquired an undisputed leadership in Western culture, but this was now in crisis due to the two great wars. And so was raised the possibility of a renewal of Christianity as a leading cultural influence, and with this made pressing the question of the relationship between Christianity and humanism. At the close of the Middle Ages, two things had happened that signalled a new age. Firstly, Dooyeweerd says, one life sphere after another wrested itself loose from the Church's power. And secondly, a new religious ground motive, that of nature and freedom, began to take shape. Dooyeweerd sees that at this point there was a new opportunity for Western culture to choose its fundamental direction. On the one hand, emancipation from the faith of the Church, or on the other hand, a return to the ground motive of Scripture. The Renaissance movement, he writes, the early forerunner of humanism, followed the first path with varying consistency. The Reformation followed the second. In this chapter, Dooyeweerd appears to follow two lines of thought, switching between them in a way that's not always easy to follow. The first traces the development of the humanistic ground motive through its philosophical development. The second follows its development in relation to political thought. So in the first line, the development proceeds first from the humanistic religion of freedom, as expressed in the science ideal, with mathematical thought and strict natural science providing the model to reconstruct our understanding of nature in Descartes and society in Hobbes, and so bringing it under our control, and banishing superstition. Moving on secondly to a crisis in the science ideal brought about by the empiricist criticism of Locke and especially Hume. And then thirdly, leading to a response to this crisis, first from Rousseau, who sets the humanistic ground motive against the science ideal and back to the freedom motive, also called the personality ideal, and also a response from Kant, who also favours the freedom motive, but aims to maintain the science ideal with a limited role through the separation of science from faith. The second line follows the same pattern but applies it to political theory. First off, there is the humanistic religion of freedom, as expressed with a break from the undifferentiated society of the Middle Ages and realised in a rationally conceived absolute state in thinkers like Hobbes and Bodin. Secondly, Locke's classical liberalism and the development of a limited idea of the state. And thirdly, Rousseau's idea of radical democracy. We'll begin by tracing the first line of development. Here Dooyeweerd begins with the Renaissance, which looked for a rebirth of humankind based on a return to a Greco-Roman ideals. However, this did not mean a return to the Greek ground motive. Instead, it had already gone through the Christian and medieval ground motives and involved removing nature from the Church's control, with grace being replaced by a faith in human personality and its autonomy. The anti-Christian element of this was clear in Machiavelli, who believed that the Christian message that one should love one's enemies contradicted human virtue. Now, while Descartes drew a firm line between the bodily or material world and the human soul, and so limited nature to the material world, the control motive of autonomous humanity aims at subjecting nature and all of its unlimited possibilities to humankind by means of the new method of mathematical science. Dooyeweerd writes that nowhere in reality does it tolerate the validity of limits to the operation of the natural scientific method. And in line with this, Thomas Hobbes attacked Descartes' artificial separation and aimed at applying Galileo's method consistently, utilizing it in the areas of morality, law, political life, and even the motions of the human soul. This method, as with Descartes, involved universal doubt about reality as it is presented in ordinary experience. As such, one should begin by mentally breaking down the whole of that reality to the extent that its truth is not guaranteed by scientific inquiry. Then, with a conscious allusion to the creation story, Hobbes argued that scientific thought must shed light upon the chaos and must systematically rebuild the world again by the means of the exact scientific method. In this way, Hobbes reduced everything, including mathematical thinking, to the motions of material things. While the science ideal dominated, humanists were convinced that only the method of thought developed by modern mathematics and natural science teaches human beings to know reality as it is in itself, stripped of all the subjective additions and errors of human consciousness which victimize us in the naive experience of daily life. However, this raised a critical question. Where do concepts of the exact sciences come from? It would appear that they are found in the very subjective consciousness that they were meant to do away with. The empiricists Locke and Hume argued that since these concepts are not found among children or primitive peoples, they must have arisen in the course of time. Here they looked to sensory perception as our only window to the reality of the so-called external world. In particular, David Hume's critical empiricism struck a serious blow to the metaphysical pretensions of the deterministic science ideal, which claimed that science could furnish knowledge of reality as it is in itself. For example, he argued that science finds its origins in sense impressions, but that from these impressions one could derive neither exact mathematical relationships nor the mechanical laws of cause and effect that constituted the foundation of classical mechanics. Perception merely taught that there is a temporal sequence of sense impressions from fact A to fact B. It never demonstrated that B always and necessarily follows A, and yet this demonstration was what the laws of physical science required. Since there is no limit to this method, the whole of reality is to be grasped in terms of a closed chain of cause and effect. As such, even human reality must come under this method, and so there is not left any room for human freedom. The unbound nature of human freedom as expressed in the scientific method therefore ends in the erasure of human freedom itself. For if the human person belongs to nature, then it cannot possibly be free and autonomous. So nature and freedom, science ideal and personality ideal, turn out to oppose each other as declared enemies. This reveals an irreconcilable conflict within the humanistic ground motive of nature and freedom. Humanism's deepest religious impulse is embodied in the modern ideal of the personality, the cult of the human person understood as an end in itself. However, this freedom was to find its highest expression in its mastery over nature. This in turn brought forth the science ideal, which claimed to analyze and reconstruct reality as a completely determined and closed chain of cause and effect. For such an analysis to be completed, it must of necessity explain human reality and so destroy the freedom on which the scientific method was based. It was Immanuel Kant who most clearly recognized this conflict and sought to save humanism from its own inner contradictions. But before Dooyeweerd comes to Kant and later reactions to these problems, he traces the influence of the humanistic ground motive in the political theories of the modern age. We now follow the line of development through political thought, and Dooyeweerd begins with the breakup of medieval ecclesiastical culture, where there began a process of differentiation in society that brought to the fore the idea of the state. He writes that gradually absolute monarchs regained for the crown many of the prerogatives that had fallen into the hands of private lords under the feudal system. The new humanistic science ideal suggested an exact method by means of which this could be done. The science ideal is religious in character and so leads towards absolutist positions. It is also about human freedom expressed through control, and so it is to be expected that when applied to the idea of the state, it did not acknowledge that governmental authority is limited intrinsically by societal spheres grounded in the creation order. Any such recognition would contradict the humanist religious ground motive. The new idea of the state was designed as an instrument of control that could gather all power to itself. This modern humanistic view of the state was set out by Jean Bodin, for whom the essential characteristic of sovereignty lay in its absolute competence or power unlimited by positive juridical boundaries. Characteristic of the new doctrine of natural law was its individualistic construction of societal spheres, particularly the sphere of the state. Bodin's concept of absolute sovereignty was dominant while the science ideal held sway. This conception was made acceptable to the notion of free personality through the idea of a social contract. It was argued that by means of a social compact, the originally free and equal individuals had surrendered their natural freedom voluntarily in order to bind themselves as a body politic. This was generally followed by a contract of authority and subjection, in which the people conferred authority to a sovereign and pledged obedience. John Locke was among the first modern thinkers not satisfied with this natural law construction of an absolute state. His starting points were the inalienable rights of life, property, and freedom, which could not be surrendered even in a contract. This laid the basis for the classical liberal view of the state, where the state is a limited liability company, organised to protect these rights. The natural law theories of Locke and Rousseau aimed at two concrete goals: the breakthrough of the idea of the state in terms of the final breakdown of the undifferentiated feudal structures, and the breakthrough of the fundamental idea of civil law, or in other words, the idea of human rights. Dooyeweerd considers both of these positive developments. The feudal system of the Middle Ages made government a matter of the private right of the ruler. For the state to develop its own right as a differentiated institution, it was necessary for it to be recognised as a public entity, or a res publica. Locke opposed Hobbes's absolutistic concept of sovereignty that left the people unprotected from their ruler. He developed the notion of representative government so that where the king no longer promoted the cause of the people and the common good, and if the people lacked democratic and parliamentary institutions, then the people could resort to revolution. In Locke, the state was viewed as an association among individuals with the purpose of defending the individual's natural right to life, liberty, and property. Locke's liberal conception of the state did not imply a universal right to vote on the part of every citizen. So for classical liberalism, democracy was not an end in itself. Rather, it was a means to protect private property rights. This was why it came into conflict with radical democracy, where democracy was an end in itself. Rousseau was not satisfied with Locke's approach and went beyond the essentially private legal human rights, which constitute the foundations of civil private law, to the public legal guarantee of the freedom and autonomy of human personality in the inalienable rights of the citizen. This laid the foundations for the humanist idea of democracy, which came into conflict with the classical liberal idea of the state. Dooyeweerd questions the interpretation that liberalism is based on the principle of freedom, while democracy is based on equality. As he understands it, the contrast between liberalism and radical democracy is that the former advocates a moderate democracy that is tempered by representative institutions. Radical democracy rejects a representative system and is a clearer expression of the humanistic ideal of freedom. Rousseau, the apostle of radical democracy, was also the spokesman for the humanistic ideal of freedom. Rousseau was religiously obsessed, says Dooyeweerd, with guaranteeing autonomous freedom as a political right. For him, the state must completely absorb the natural freedom of a person into the higher form of political freedom, of active citizenship rights, which inherently belong to all citizens equally, and not merely to an elite among them. On this view, individuals must surrender all their natural freedoms to the state in order to receive this freedom back in a higher political sense. Dooyeweerd argues that Rousseau's radical democracy is totalitarian in every respect. It contains the paradoxical conclusion that the highest freedom of persons lies in the utter absolutism of the state. Despite his sharp criticisms of Rousseau, he ends this section with an acknowledgement of his insights. He pointedly brought the res publica conception to the foreground, and he viewed equality in strictly political terms rather than applying it indiscriminately to all relationships of life.